Hello everyone, it's Mark Goodacre here. Welcome to the NT Pod, the podcast all about the New Testament and Christian origins. It is episode 104, and today we're looking at the Synoptic Translation Problem. I recently finished writing a book on the fourth Gospel, and I made a commitment early on that I later regretted because I decided that it would be easiest if I simply use the NRSV or the NRSV updated edition for all my English translations in the book. My reason for thinking this is it would be much less arbitrary than doing my own translations. I always worry about doing my own translations that people might think I'm cooking the evidence. And also I thought it'd be kind of easier, so I wouldn't be giving myself the challenge the whole time of how do I translate this, how do I translate that. So I thought it would be easier, but do you know what? It wasn't. It was a real problem. And in earlier books, I would do my own translations, but then I would be nervous that I'd basically just repeated standard translations, or even worse, that I might have missed things and committed errors that would, be in print for perpetuity. So I thought this was a good idea to commit to using the NRSV and then the NRSV updated edition when that came out. And it turned out it wasn't, and I'll explain why in a moment. I do want to digress before getting to the point, though, to say I do like academic books that include English translations when you've got Greek, Hebrew, Coptic, or whatever else. I understand why lots of scholars don't want to use English translations. I think it's because, well, to be honest, I think it's because of a bit of snobbiness. I think that they feel that if you're reading an academic book about the New Testament, you really ought to be able to read Greek. And until you can read Greek, you can't read their book. I kind of get that. But I'll tell you why I think it's so important to translate the Greek in this case, or Hebrew, whatever else it is that you're doing. I think of myself when I was 16, 17 years old, before I'd learnt Greek. I was trying to read everything that I could about the New Testament. I was already obsessed with it. And when I picked up books that had got Greek in them, they were closed off to me. So I liked books that actually translated the Greek. I wanted to read these books, and they were putting a barrier up for me. And really what they should have been doing was inviting me into that whole world. And so I am surprised that more scholars don't think this way, and that more scholars don't provide translations when they're writing their books. But, we all have different trajectories, we'll have different origin stories, but that's mine. And I continue to do it because I know that it then makes the books accessible to a broader public, whether it's a kind of the interested, independent student or scholar, or whether it's my undergraduate students. Frequently, undergraduate students today are taking courses in religious studies outside of a religious studies major, and therefore the number of them with Greek is very, very small. And I'd like to be able to assign my own students my own books or articles sometimes. I don't get them to buy them. I'm not into that whole sort of game, but I do like them to read my stuff if possible. Anyway, back to the point. Using translations when you are doing synopses of the Gospels. I found that in example after example, having committed to using the NRSV and the NRSV updated edition, that I have to keep adjusting the text. And so I have to keep having footnotes that say, well, this is what it says in the NRSV updated edition, but this is why I'm translating it differently. And the reason I keep having to do that is that I didn't realise the extent of this until recently. They translate exactly the same word in different ways, in parallel verses, in many, many examples. Let me illustrate what I mean. If you look at the death of Jesus in the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew 27:50, Mark 15:37, Luke 23:46, when you look at that, you read Matthew 27:50 in the NRSV and the NRSV updated edition, and it reads like this. Then Jesus cried again with a loud voice and breathed his last. Now, what the Greek actually says is something more akin to, he gave up his spirit. Now, this is important because when you read Mark 15:37 in the NRSV, you get, then Jesus gave a loud cry and breathed his last. So what happens is, if you're looking at these two verses side by side, Matthew 27:50, Mark 15:37, it looks like they're identical in the Greek, and they're not. They're different. Matthew doesn't say Jesus breathed his last. That's a paraphrase. To be fair to them, they do actually have a little footnote saying it could be gave up his spirit. But there's another reason that this is important to me, and that's that when you look at the Lucan parallel, 23:46, you have then Jesus crying out with a loud voice, said, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." Having said this, he breathed his last. Now, what's interesting about the Lucan parallel here, for people like me who think that Luke knew Mark and Matthew, what Luke has done is quite an interesting development of what you see in Matthew and Mark. So he does have with Mark that he breathed his last, but he also has this line, "Into your hands I commit my spirit," which looks like it's picking up on, I think, Matthew's note that Jesus gave up his spirit. What it's doing is something that you often see when one source takes over another source. You get a kind of dramatic transformation where the narrator's words, here, he gave up his spirit, are put into direct speech, here Jesus saying, "Into your hands I commit my spirit." Luke is also influenced here by Psalm 31:5, where you have this line. But the reason for pointing this out is that if you looked at this in a synopsis of the New Revised Standard Version Updated Edition, you wouldn't realise that Luke has quite interesting parallels to Matthew as well as to Mark. Let me take another example. This is one that you find in all four of the canonical Gospels, the Synoptic Gospels and John. In Matthew 26:51, Mark 14:47, Luke 22:50, and John 18:10, we have the story of the high priest's slave's ear being cut off. One of the most extraordinary stories in the Gospels, and it's in all four of the canonical Gospels. And in fact, this is one of my favourite pieces to use in classes on the Synoptics and on John, because each evangelist adds something a little bit different. Well, that's a story for another day. I'd like to go into that in more detail at some point. But what I'd like to comment on here is that the word for strike or hit, when the high priest slave is hit with the sword, is different. In Matthew and Luke, they use the Greek word patasso, whereas Mark and John use the word pio. But when you look at the NRSV and the NRSV Updated Edition, all four Gospels read the same, struck. So what happens is it creates a fourfold parallel, where in fact there's quite an interesting contrast here. Matthew and Luke have one word, Mark and John have another word. So it's like a translation that harmonizes the difference between the Synoptic Gospels and John. I could go on and on with examples, but let me take another choice one. This is one that I've given a lot of thought to because, as I mentioned earlier, I've recently finished writing a book about John's Gospel. It's called The Fourth Synoptic Gospel. And one of the reasons that it has that title is that I try and draw attention to places where John behaves like a fourth Synoptic Gospels. And this is one of those occasions, the story of the anointing of Jesus by an anonymous woman in Matthew and Mark and Luke, and by Mary, the sister of Martha, in John. This is found in Matthew 26, 6-13, Mark 14, 3-9, John 12, 1-8, and we can compare it with Luke 7, 36-50. Now, in all four Gospels, you have the same word used for the ointment or the perfume that she puts on Jesus. But in the NRSV Updated Edition, the Synoptics all have ointment, and John has perfume. So you get 3 lots of ointment in Matthew, 3 lots of ointment in Mark, 3 lots of ointment in Luke, and 3 lots of perfume in John. It is exactly the same word. Now, the reason why that's important is that people frequently say, doesn't John look different from the Synoptics? And therefore John can't have used the Synoptics. And one of the reasons that we often think that John is different from the Synoptics, or at least one of the reasons we think it's more different than it actually is because we're translating exactly the same stuff differently. And there's a further interesting parallel in the same passage. The ointment or the perfume is described in the same way in both Mark and John. Both Mark and John have very costly perfume of pure nard. That's my translation. Now, when you get to the NRSV Updated Edition, in Mark it's very costly ointment of nard, and in John it's costly perfume of pure nard. So what the NRSV Updated Edition does is it has very in Mark, but not in John, and pure in John, but not in Mark. But effectively, Mark has got both of those, and John's got both of those. So what happens there is that the parallel between Mark and John is diminished in the act of translating. That actually obscures something quite important, because this is a really, really unusual way of describing perfume, and it's something that I think goes over from Mark to John's Gospel. Lots more examples of things like that in my forthcoming book. Oh gosh, I've mentioned that 3 times now. Apologies for that, it's been on my mind. Another example, Matthew 28:10 and John 20, verse 17. This is where Jesus at the resurrection tells Mary Magdalene, plus one other Mary in Matthew, to go and tell the news of his resurrection to my brothers. Now, the Greek here is identical, adelphoi, to my brothers. Now, the extraordinary thing here in the NRSV updated edition, and this is a change from the NRSV, you have brothers and sisters here in Matthew, but not in John. It's the identical word in Greek, adelphoi. But in Matthew, brothers and sisters. In John, just brothers. So it makes it look like either John is being less inclusive than Matthew, or Matthew's being more inclusive than John. But actually they're both identical. The only reason that they look different is because different translators have worked on those different passages. Now perhaps you might think this is not that big a deal. But to me, the problem with this is it completely hides synoptic agreements, and it completely hides synoptic and John agreements. Sometimes also it creates phantom agreements, false positives, although that's less common. And I suppose the thing that makes me a little sad about this is it turns out that Bible translators don't love the synoptic problem as much as we all do. Perhaps we shouldn't be surprised, but I do find it sad, because it means that a very important tool in scholarship is basically being taken away from the reader that doesn't have Greek. It's always been a mystery to me as to why this happens so much. I was aware of the problem before, although it's become much starker since I've been working on John and the Synoptics. And it just happens repeatedly and in really obvious ways. Shouldn't you want to help your readers to see where the Synoptics are genuinely similar and where they're different? Well, I did actually get a little insight recently, and so I should also make a confession, which is that I was involved with the NRSV updated edition. I was asked to be the book editor for Matthew's Gospel, which was a huge honour, and it was work I really enjoyed doing. This was a few years ago now, but the NRSV updated edition was only recently published. And one of the things I enjoyed about that work was that, synoptic nerd that I am, I repeatedly pointed to places where it was necessary to do synoptic checks, making sure that the term was translated the same way where it was paralleled in Mark and Luke. Because if you change it in Matthew, but then you don't change it in Mark and Luke, you will actually create false agreements and false disagreements. I confess, though, that it didn't always occur to me when I was doing that, perhaps because I wasn't working as intensely on John at the time. It didn't occur to me to ask the editors to take a look at John, where I was suggesting changes for Matthew. So I actually checked my notes, and it turns out I did make a strong case that "and sisters" should be added in Matthew 28:10. That's the passage I was just talking about, where Jesus appears to Mary Magdalene and the other Mary. But I didn't think to say, and by the way, make sure that John is the same here. And so that, of course, is what happens. You've got one book editor for Matthew, in this case me, and then you've got another book editor for John. And they haven't got means of connecting these two things together lots of the time. And therein lies the problem. Bible translators have to outsource their work to individuals who can give a particular book the kind of love that it deserves. And most of the time that works. I think that overall, the New Revised Standard Version updated edition is better than its predecessor. But the Synoptic Gospels and John are a special problem, and they do require a huge amount of cross-referencing. So my suggestion for the future, for my ideal translation, my translation that would take the Synoptic Gospels and John seriously, perhaps even an update of the updated edition, give one person the task of checking across all the parallels, making sure that things are translated in the same way in the different Gospels if they are the same, and translated differently if they're different. And if anyone's looking for volunteers, I know that I'm not the only synoptic nerd who would love to do it. Well, thank you for listening to this latest episode of the NT Pod. I'll be along again soon with another episode. You can find me on the web at podacre.blogspot.com or look up my YouTube channel at Podacre. Find me on social media, look for Goodacre. Thank you very much for listening. Bye-bye.